Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the Peterson Institute for International Economics. We are kind of going up and down the spectrum as part of our commitment to make sure we're current on views and, in this case, analyses, not just views, of the biggest issues facing our economy. Yesterday, as many of you know or saw, and a few of you were here, we had the Special Assistant to the President and Chair of the National Economic Council, Larry Kudlow. Today, we are moving in a different direction in multiple senses, and I'm very pleased to have with us David Blanchflower up to do the Washington premiere of his new book, Not Working, Where Have All the Good Jobs Gone? This is the most important way, without wanting to be mean, that this is different from Dr. Kudlow's remarks, is this is a very independent-minded and empirically grounded academic piece of research. And yet it remains quite policy relevant. And I stress that because, as many of you know, Danny goes by Danny Blanchflower, who's a good friend. Danny is the person who I think exceeded me for number of votes on the Monetary Policy Committee, where he was 1 against 8. And he has been, both before and after that experience, a leading labor economist, going in where the data takes him in very policy relevant and very sometimes unconventional directions. The topic today, there's a summary up there which I'll let Danny take you through, but just to say is of critical importance, is we've heard from many quarters, including from Dr. Kudlow, there are genuine disputes about whether the Federal Reserve and other central banks, including our alma mater, the Bank of England, have properly measured unemployment, and whether we should be looking what is the right measure of labor market slack, both in terms of human welfare, how should we take account of the costs of unemployment and what it means to people, but also in the sense of forecasting. What implications do various measures of labor market slack have for inflation? And this is one of the places where the structural analysis, the real analysis and hard data, combine with macroeconomic theory. Not working where all the good jobs have gone is really focused on the phenomenon of the underemployed. And this is something that Danny has written about and drawn attention to, both here and in the UK. This is the main book being published by Princeton Press in economics this spring, which is already a big endorsement. And it is importantly a book about distribution and welfare, well-being. He is very candid that the young and the less skilled are the worst casualties of underemployment, that immigrants are being blamed for other people's problems, and links this, perhaps more speculatively to some of you, but to research on self-destructive behaviors and measures of unhappiness as well. So this is at not just the critical point for central banking and not just the critical point for labor, but a critical point for political economy. The book, again, is Not Working, Where Have All the Good Jobs Gone? Danny has been the Bruce V. Rauner Professor of Economics at Dartmouth since 2001. He's also professor of economics at the University of Stirling in the UK, a research associate in the National Bureau of Economic Research. He was a member of the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England from June 2006 to June 2009. And he was made a commander, and that's right, you're not honorary because you're a British citizen. Commander of the British Empire in the Queen's Birthday Honours List in June 2009 for services to the Monetary Policy Committee and to economics in the UK. So please let me turn it over to Danny to present his work.
Thank you. I'm pleased to see Olivia over here. When I was a graduate student, I used to go along, and I first met him, he may not remember, and we used to study labor economics, but where I actually met him was the unemployment seminar at the LSE. And actually, for a really long time, labor economics was the study of unemployment. And I used to teach all about unemployment not least because all the other measures that we're going to talk about today were very nicely correlated with it. If you talked about employment, it was essentially the same story as talking about unemployment. But I'm going to talk today a little bit about the fact that actually no longer is that true. And I worked on a book called The Wage Curve with Andrew Oswald for years, where we tried to think about the relationship between wages and unemployment. And that book seemed to apply pretty darn well to lots of countries and lots of time periods. And then came the Great Recession. And we're going to talk about kind of fundamentally what changed, whether this is a permanent change or not, but we're 10 years in or so. And this book's about jobs, decent jobs that pay well, the lack of them, and the consequences of not delivering those jobs, especially for people who are less educated. I think it's sort of analogous to the work that Deaton and Case are doing. And both of us kind of take the view that a lot of what's going on, a lot of the pain and hurt and suffering we're seeing is driven by failures in the labor market. So that's what I'm going to talk about. But I'm going to sort of broaden it from unemployment and try and show you that that's really important. And I think macro errors are being made, partly because policymakers haven't really understood what we've just talked about, and particularly call labour markets at being at full employment. And I always say, if we were at full employment, why would so many people be hurting so much? So that's a lot of what I'm going to talk about. When I was researching for this, there's about 3 little sort of housekeeping things I want to do. The first is, I actually went to Gallup, and it's kind of cool. On Gallup's webpage, it actually says, basically, the most important thing that Gallup's ever found is that what the world wants is a good job. And we can think about what that means, but it means jobs that are stable, secure, and have decent pay to them. And I think that's really important. And in the book, I talk a lot about how those failures have led to votes for populism, and I think Angus and Anne have talked about how many, particularly in the US, they've led to deaths of despair. But I'm going to document the hurt that's come from labour market failure. I want to do a couple of things quickly. The first is, oops, wrong way, that way. The first is, there's a set of lots of papers that back this up. There's no regressions in here, there's no math in here, but mostly it's done in papers that are related to it, and with Adam and Andy Levin and others, Andrew Oswald, David Bell, others. Here's the thing that struck me. Very early on, in 2009, I started to try and think about what happens after a major financial crisis. And I found this paper people don't seem to be aware of. I found this paper by Keynes in 1931, writing about, after the crash, what's coming. And I think I have in my head, there have been 2 great crashes, 2 great financial crises. And actually what's happened after them is what Keynes refers to here. And I had this in my head for a really long time. I think it's a great quote. And in some sense, you might think that Reinhard Rogoff talked about the consequence of financial crisis. But this is different. This is a paper that Keynes wrote prior to the Great Crash, the Great Depression coming. For it's a possibility the duration of the slump may be much more prolonged than most people are expecting. Much will we change both in our ideas and in our methods before we emerge. Not of course the duration of the acute phase of the slump, but that of the long dragging conditions of semi-slump, or at least subnormal prosperity, which may be expected to succeed the acute phase first. So I've had that in my head for a really long time, and I think that kind of well characterizes what happened in the 30s and what happened now, and gives you similarities. I have a second. Whoops, what happened there? Oh, something happened. Okay, try again. I'm doing well. Okay, so I actually broke my ankle, and I intend now to spend the winter in Florida. And I was trying to read Beveridge's 1944 book called Full Employment, trying to think about what full employment means if central bankers say we're at full employment. Go back and read that. Well, it turned out I couldn't get the Dartmouth copy. The only thing I could do was go and get one on Amazon. And I've never seen this version on Amazon, because it turns out there's a 1960 version that Beveridge wrote. And Beveridge, if you don't know, was Churchill went to him as an academic in Britain in 1943 and said, go and tell us what the world will look like after the war, set up a national health service, but think about what full employment means. And he says, so I wrote this thing in 44, and I said, I think unemployment at 3% would be full employment. And he said, Keynes wrote to me and said, well, that's a good idea, because I was taught that forever, that 3% unemployment is full employment. He said, Keynes wrote to me and said, it's a really good idea, but I think it's probably too low, but go away and try. And I'd never read this before. In 1960, Beveridge says, so now I look back to see whether Keynes was right. And it turns out between 1948 and 1960, unemployment in the UK averaged not 3% or 4% or 5%, it averaged 1.5%. So I had in my head, as I was writing this, that perhaps economies can have unemployment that surprises on the low side, and a lot of this story is perhaps that the narrow full employment is much lower than people think, just as it was both to Beveridge and Keynes in the 50s in the UK. So I'm going to start out and think about wages and just sort of give you a couple of little plots. The book's got a lot about why did people vote for Trump, why did they vote for Brexit, and essentially it's to do with, if you do it by place, it's to do with characteristics of place. You can do it by wages. You can see that in the UK, the vote for leave was a function of the weekly wage by county. Sorry, go the other way. And the same in the US. And you can do it by all kinds of other characteristics, but wages seem sort of central to all of this. So that's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about errors, and I'm going to start out thinking about errors that happened in 2008. I'm going to think about weak wage growth, and I'm going to worry about errors today, perhaps thinking that maybe the errors that we saw in 2008 are being repeated. And I think they're being repeated because we're not at full employment. People have made mistakes thinking we are. And if we were at full employment, I would expect to see a whole host of things that I don't, one of which is wage growth, but a lot of other things that I've been thinking about I haven't seen. I'm particularly working now on what happens to labour markets as the unemployment rate moves from 6 to 5 to 4 to 3. Wouldn't we expect to start to see sort of discontinuities and other things happening? So a lot of stuff in the book is actually about not just doing sort of macro forecasting, it's trying to adapt it and think about what I call the economics of walking about. But it's actually about collecting data on what people say and do. I mean, I've done a lot of stuff on happiness data, but I'm quite interested in happiness data from firms, where you ask firms, what do you think's going on? So this turns out to be a big dilemma that people had in 2008. And I started voting for rate cuts from October 2007, not least because of this kind of stuff in the UK, but this kind of stuff in America too. So I just want to focus on this a minute. So this turns out central banks, certainly in the UK and in the US, even by August 2008, had actually missed the downturn that had come. If you go to the minutes of the Fed meeting in September 2008, it's quite clear they hadn't really spotted that the labour market had actually, the economy had gone into recession in December 2007. Turns out if you look at these kinds of things, I don't need people to worry especially what this is, but I remember sitting at the bank meetings and essentially economists were saying one thing, and then for 3 hours every meeting, and then at the end, the last 10 minutes, we'd have reports given by the bank's agents, and they collect scores. And now looking back, what it turns out is by, let's say around May, August 2008, so you don't need to see what each of these scores are, but some of them are construction output, investment intentions, recruitment difficulties, capacity constraints. Well, it turns out by May, August 2008, those levels had just collapsed. And it turns out there were other series of data across Europe which were exactly the same. And what you actually saw was a consistent pattern by every sector, retail, construction, manufacturing, and then by consumers, that all these series had actually collapsed, coordinated as well across all the countries. So that seemed particularly telling. And I kept talking then about, and obviously what I'm going to say to you is we're seeing these same things turn down now. So that's the reason I'm doing this, and not unrelated to the disconnect between the Fed and the markets. Oops, sorry, it's done it again. I just want to go to talking about this. So by 2008, this is kind of crucial to me. So in the UK, it turned out that there was a really big disconnect. And I'm just trying to get to the difficulty, and this is just the difficulty that forecasters have, and just the difficulty we have by looking at normal data that economists are used to. The benefit of the data I just showed you is it's timely. The surveys are done 2 weeks later, you get the answer, and it's not revised. So let me just show you the difficulty, and the worry that I have is maybe we're at such a similar point now. So I got thrown for a loop by that number at the top, the 0.2. So I kept saying in the UK there's going to be a horrible recession coming, and I kept saying I should vote for rate cuts. And I got, in July 2008, we got a plus 0.2, which just threw me for a loop. Well, then what I'm going to show you here is the same for each of those quarters. So this is what happened month by month. And if you said, well, let's wait to see what the real data looks like, turns out that would have been a real problem. And may well be a real problem now, because this is quite clearly now the turning point. So that plus 0.2, we actually know today is minus 0.7. And it took about a year, almost exactly a year, for that number to actually turn negative. So to actually say, when did we officially use in GDP data know that the UK had gone into recession? In Q2 '08, the answer was in July '09. So obviously the argument that you should wait until you actually see, if you like, the whites of the eyes of output drops, you would have been in trouble here. You probably, if you'd have waited, you would have actually known in January '09 that you had two successive negative quarters in Q3 and Q4, but you would have assumed wrongly that the recession had started later. So that's obviously a problem, and I see. So I would characterize them essentially where we were in August 2008, when the committee that I was on made this forecast. So this forecast, just for people to know what I mean by you don't know where you've been, you don't know where you're going, and you don't know where you are. So this was the forecast made in August 2008 that I signed up to, and a week later I decided was completely wrong. But this is the MPC produces this, and this is it has a backcast to it, which is the area to the left, which says that we actually thought the data that I showed you was going to be revised up, not down. The black line is the actual number, and the backcast is what people think is going to happen to the past. So we got the past wrong, we got the present wrong, and this forecast in August 2008 said there will be no recession. And the word recession in the 50-page report we produced didn't have the word recession in it. And it said there might be 1 quarter of weak growth around 0. So obviously I kind of have that completely in my head when I think about what's going on here, that we made a terrible error. Oh, golly, so I keep pressing the wrong thing. Come on, speak to Danny. There we go. So why has wage growth been so weak? That's what I'm going to try and think about. I'm going to think about the fact that, as Adam suggested to me, things seem to fundamentally have changed. And obviously the forces here, I think, have been going on a long time, but I have to sort of persuade you that something happened in '08. So the Great Recession, in my view, exposed underlying weaknesses and had a very big impact on people who lost their pension pots, who lost their houses, and became very scared, if you like. So I think this is an exposure of underlying weaknesses, and it appears that there's a quantum change. And I think what we've seen particularly here is that tightening rates by the Fed have had a major impact. And I'm going to show you that actually focusing on the unemployment rate turns out to be a mistake. So let's go. So here's the story for this. I'm sorry for all the lines here, but I think a story we need to kind of look at is about similarity and dissimilarity. So this is the United States. Can we just focus, please, on the green and the orangey lines? So this is back to Olivier and the unemployment seminar. If you look prior to around 2008 on the right there, the employment rate and the unemployment rate just moved beautifully in sync with each other. If we'd have called it the employment seminar, we'd have done the same things. We wouldn't have done anything any different. But what you've got on the right is the unemployment rate gets back to well below its starting level, but the employment rate in the US is over 2 percentage points below where it was in '08. The other thing is the declining participation rate, which people here have argued, and I heard a talk in this room saying it's all about aging and technology, which doesn't make a lot of sense given that every other country in the world has had pretty much the same aging, pretty much the same technology, and none of them have had a declining participation rate. But we can talk more perhaps about that in a bit. So it turns out that if you plot, so the purple line is actually the series we're particularly going to care about. I like this series. This is the production and non-supervisory wage. You can get it for hourly or for weekly. The reason I like it is that it goes back a long time to 64. It's not like a 2006 series for the other private sector earnings. You can do it for hourly, you can do it for weekly. Private production non-supervisory, it's about 80% of workers in the private sector, and it excludes the top end, so it's kind of nice. So basically what you see, if you draw the line across for an unemployment rate of the levels that we're at today, you should really be expected to see levels of 4%, maybe even higher than that, at the equivalent unemployment rate. And you don't. And essentially you need to try and explain that And this seems a fundamental issue in labor economics, and this is a phenomenon pretty much across the globe here. So the phenomenon is not that it's not that the employment rates or the participation rates of income, let's put that aside. What it turns out in the UK and Germany and the Netherlands and the US and Canada and elsewhere, and I talk about them all in the book, is that they all have weak wage growth, and they all have this peculiar series, which I've been working on a lot, which is the underemployment rate, which is what I call U7. To make life easy, in the papers I explain what it is. Just to make it easy, it's taken out of U6, and it's actually part-time for economic reasons divided by employment. Just a quick second, U6 adds on to the unemployment rate, adds on discouraged workers and marginal workers, both the numerator and denominator, because if you add workers who are outside the labor force, you have to add it both to the top and to the labor. But it turns out all the action actually comes from part-time for economic reasons. So the simplest thing to do is throw out any movement of that variable from numerator or denominator. So I just define it as part-time for economic reasons as a proportion of employment, and then you can kind of do a horse race with it against the unemployment rate, which of course is what I do. Turns out in the UK we have exactly the same thing. So the blue series is the underemployment rate, and the red-orangey series is the unemployment rate. So the first thing is you want to try and understand why wage growth is weak. Well, you've got to find a series that essentially hasn't returned back to where it was. Turns out everywhere this series kind of works. And I want to just add one thing. In most things, the US shines. In two areas that I work in, the US data stinks. This is it. So it's not very good on giving you happiness data, but here's a series I just want people to have in their minds. So what we can do, we have a new paper, we can do it for every European country. I was just talking about, for every European country, we have it for the UK as well. In the US, we ask you, are you part-time for economic reasons? That's my measure of underemployment. But it turns out for every EU country and for the UK, I can calculate this series, which is as follows. Are you part-time for economic reasons? Yes or no? Right, I've got that. And then they say the following. How many hours do you work? How many hours would you like to work? So imagine you say, I'm working 20. You could say, I'd like to work 25. So let's assume that gives us an underemployment measure in hours space. You could also say, I would like to work 15. So now I've got a measure of overemployment. Turns out this is in the equivalent surveys in Europe, the CPS. They're exactly the equivalent of the CPS. They're the labour force surveys. So then you can calculate the series, which is in millions of hours. You can calculate in millions of hours how many additional hours people would like to work. Turns out this series is really fantastic across all these countries. And there's something weird we didn't know. So the first thing is we don't have that measure for underemployment. We also in the US don't have the series for overemployment. Turns out that series is not so important as the blue line. And a thing we were not aware of is that in full employment, if you like, prior to 2006 or so, the red series is above the blue series, which we'd not seen before, replicated lots of times. But now we have exactly this series across countries. Let me just go one more. I have to do a little bit of technical. But what that means is that now, because we've got this for everybody, we could have a measure of underemployment or overemployment for every individual. It turns out we have two other groups that we know about their labour market characteristics. The first group, obviously, is now we know whether full-timers are underemployed or overemployed. Many of them turn out to be overemployed, but we have a measure that the US doesn't have for full-timers. Turns out in the data that's not so important. The next group is really the big one that matters, because in the US we don't ask you if you're part-time, are you happy being part-time and would you like to change your hours? Turns out that's a really big deal in lots of the data that we have. Say it again, three groups: voluntary part-timers, involuntary part-timers, full-timers. In the US, we only get to that group in the middle. We actually have lots of underemployment, it turns out, from part-timers who say, yeah, I'm happy to be part-time. I'd still like to be part-time. I don't want to be full-time, but I got 10 hours, I'd like 15. And why that matters, numerically, those numbers of hours are quite small, but numerically, these people may be 5, 6, 7 times as many of them. So the US completely misses that. So we've done lots of work on this, and it turns out these measures are really important. And it turns out we thought we could go to all these European countries and try and work out the extent of the bias in the US. Turns out we can't really do that because there's a huge variation across countries, but I have a new paper coming out in the ILR review soon, which talks about that. How am I doing for time, Adam?
Okay.
5 minutes or so? Good, I'm good. Okay, so here's the regression results, which is actually a really big deal. So the wage curve Blanchard and Oswald worked on was basically the second column. Olivia said to me, do I have to throw the wage curve book away? No, because I can still replicate it. He was kind of right. So the second column is the standard wage curve where we estimate with state and year fixed effects, log WT on WT minus 1 and the U3, which is the unemployment rate. So that gives you a very pretty nice wage curve. And actually, if you estimate it for the whole time period, hunky-dory. But our problem is when we started to do this, column 3, the unemployment rate doesn't enter a wage equation in 2008 to 17 in the most recent data. Other people have replicated that, so it's not just Danny doing it. But then you go to the right, and what you find is, well, surprise, surprise, you say, oh, you haven't got enough data, whatever. Surprise, surprise, when I simply in the US put my U7 measure in, it's present for the whole time period. It actually looks like it even works better than the unemployment rate. In 1980 to 2007, I should have known when I did the wage curve. I didn't know because I never worked on it, just didn't think of it, that it works there. But the big deal is the underemployment rate enters wage equations in the final column and the unemployment rate doesn't. And we find exactly the same thing for the UK. So it's not that there's not a Phillips curve in wage unemployment space. There's a Phillips curve, if you like, or a wage curve anyway. In wage labour market slack space, we could just think that the unemployment rate's a measure of slack. And then you get much flatter stuff. You get, it suggests, and you essentially take that and suggest that perhaps the narrow is much lower than you think. But it means you shouldn't be focusing on the unemployment rate. Do the same for the UK. Okay. At the same time, a lot of stuff's going on, and I just want to think, if you were at full employment, would this be going on? So the first thing you see is that in the UK, we have measures of depression, and so this is the latest data. We have a new paper from Jebo, and it turns out that there's a huge rise in depression, and actually what I find in the data, well, first of all, the thing we find is those overemployed people are unhappy too, right, but which we don't know anything about in the US labour market. But the other thing is the huge rise in the unhappiness level of the underemployed. So the underemployed are unhappy, they're underemployed. There's a background also that much of this stuff, if we look at underemployment, it focuses very much on how badly the least educated have done. Just to give you a little series, and there's lots of it, but I just ran this last night because we have the new data from the 2018 GSS. And obviously I want to sort of make connections to work, and I do that in the book. But this is just, if you plot in the US, happiness levels of just simply by 3 education groups, by years of education. And what the surprise in the US is for the college education, it's pretty flat. For people who are high school dropouts, it's falling. But if you look at the levels and the decline for high school dropouts, and it very much fits the story in my book and fits the story with Angus and Anne's work. And these folks are, if I run an underemployment equation, these are the folks who are underemployed. Anyway, John Abad has got recent work where he looks at many of the people who are out of the labour force, and he looks at their 2-year history, and he finds that they work for a week, leave for a week, but even in the weeks that they work, they're underemployed in those weeks. So this is about sort of weak connections to the labour market, but not none. I'm about done. Oh, come on, please don't do that to me again. There we are. So this is kind of where I've been thinking. So this is Andy and I wrote this thing some time ago, and we kind of thought, well, what you see is this long flat part when the unemployment rate is really high. So when unemployment's 10 and 9 and 8 and 7, nothing much happens because there's still a lot of unemployment. Then you think that this thing should tick up. And when we wrote this a while ago, we thought that the tick up would be much greater. So this is kind of how we think of the labour market, some non-linearity to it, it's picking up. But we kind of, looks like with all the stuff that we've been doing, that it really hasn't approached full employment, but we're getting there, but we're a long way away from it. So that's the book. I just want a couple of things to finish on. I'm worried about the data that I'm starting to see coming out right now. So here's a series which is kind of interesting. I started writing papers about the fear of unemployment, what people think, what do you think's happening? And a lot of those variables were kind of predictive of where we were in 2008. So there's lots of data we're seeing now, and we can talk a bit more when Adam and I start to talk a bit. But this is a series which I really like, which scares me. So this is a series which we've had in the UK, and we have it in every European country since 1985 monthly. And we just ask people, what do you think is going to happen to unemployment? And it turns out to have kind of pretty nice characteristics to it. It turns a bit early, but it's a pretty good series. And here's the thing that I'm kind of trying to understand, is when the unemployment rate in the UK starts to go from 6 to 5 to 4, the second it gets to 6, people start to think the unemployment rate is about to go up. So this series on the right is a sort of predictive series. It seems to be concerning, and certainly people in the UK, you can see that the fear of what's coming is certainly not consistent with them thinking we're at full employment. Maybe they think we're at full employment and then it's going to change and get worse, but there's lots of stuff in these data. Come on. So I'm going to finish, and lots to talk about. It seems to me that the data now are looking relatively worrying. We have data for the UK on those surveys I talked about, the bank's agents. They all look to be slowing fast. We've just had a consumer confidence number an hour ago in the US, which has fallen again. Lots of the PMIs in the US look to be weakening, and stuff around the world. And the timeliness of the surveys that I talked about are a concern. So we don't know where we were. We didn't know where we've been, and we didn't know where we were going, which was what happened in 2008. And my concern is that the same as now is going on. And the concern is that after that weak recovery, very little wage growth. The people through this recovery haven't done that well. And when I go back and forth to the UK, I sort of remind myself why there's so much rage and anger. And if you look at the data, in the UK today, real wages are 5.5% below what they were in 2008. And now perhaps we're headed into downturn. So obviously this doesn't look like full employment to me, and people are hurting. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Blanchflower. You talked fast. Usually my problem is speakers who talk too slowly. Today we had one who talked a bit fast.
Oh.
So some of our discussion may be going back over a few things you said and clarifying it.
Of course.
But let me start where you ended. So, you put up charts and you didn't really, for good reason, go through all the econometrics and the many, many papers for constituents to this book. But your last chart holds the tantalizing, if terrifying, prospect that a survey of how people feel about unemployment is a predictor of movements in wages or in employment.
Absolutely.
So in terms of your actual econometric work, have you tried using that series as a predictor of turning points? How does that work? And also, is there any proxy for that series in the US? I take it that you don't have a strictly comparable series.
I mean, quite a lot of work's going on for that. The econometrics are, I think, quite complicated in the sense that what you're seeing is for an individual country, this series moves. I mean, people here, Joe probably knows how to do this, so this would be really helpful. I mean, so what you have here, in a sense, was what's different, is you have you have a move of a series, where the series gets, say, by April 2008, it gets to levels that you've never really seen before, but every series gets to levels you've never seen before, for every country, for every series. So I've been trying to think about how you do that econometrically. It certainly looks to me, if you just take that seems like a crucial aspect. And we certainly are starting to see that happening now. And so we're doing more of that work. We can't get the micro data, we can get the month by country by year data, but other people are working on it. So it certainly is ongoing work. We have not yet got the great econometric results, which we've been working on to do exactly what you said, but others are working on it too. But it has the right characteristic. I mean, there's a policymaker. I really meant very seriously. When I said, you did the same thing. Let's see what you think. But you'd sit there and you'd say, I made a vote last month. I'm going to make another vote this month. What impacts the change? What makes me think, did I make a mistake last month? Have I done something now? And these data come in, and this is the closest you're going to get. Because you'll get something about what happened 2 weeks ago. You might even get some data on what happened since your last decision. That's not going to get revised. So I think this is a whole area of work, not developed enough, but it seems to have much better characteristics than those who are sitting running macro models and not being able to actually, and their excuse is, you should never expect us to miss the giant downturns, which that's kind of what I want you to do.
So going back to your experience, and I appreciate your focusing on the data, other people in the audience can read both contemporary and subsequent sources about what was vouchsafed to you about the future of the UK economy back then and how you were prescient. But continuing to focus on the data. So you had that chart, or table rather, of all the revisions to the agents data. And just for our audience in general, the agents data is roughly analogous to the UK to the beige books in the US. It's a different method of collection, but it's about anecdotal, impressionistic surveys of specific regions focusing on local business.
Can I just add? I mean, this morning I wanted to say that. So this morning I went and looked at what is it? I think it's the May beige book. And I've done that virtually every month for the last 3 years. And what you get if you do it is a sense of a huge disconnect. I mean, at the time when the Fed was talking about wages going to rise, I mean, today you see it. There's sections on each of the banks in the US. And there's a word that hits you every single time. It says moderate, modest wage pickup, modest changes. There's nothing in there that sounds anything like what you read in the minutes of the Fed, and that was true in '08 as well. But I think it's so the point scores I showed you is essentially exactly that. It's just they enumerate. They go to businesses and they say, right, we'll give you a score of 3 or whatever. They count it. But I think that information is pretty good. But if people want to go read it, I mean, I read it this morning. Across all of them, it says moderate, modest, and the thing you see almost everywhere is manufacturing output is negative. It says in almost all of them, which I take to be a...
Okay, but so we have a lot of expertise in the room. We have a lot of former senior Fed people who've been following the Fed in markets, and sometimes those two overlap. And in the discussion, maybe we can draw them into commenting on this.
Right.
But just sort of, I want to go back. So as kind of a guideline, if you or I or someone far more distinguished than us is sitting in the room again, is your basic advice, look at the labor market data, look at the analytical local data, ignore the GDP data because it's misleading?
Well, the answer is, if you want to think about a turning point, the answer to that would be yes. If you think there's no chance you're at a turning point, you're probably fine. But the revisions, if you did the last 30 years, that revision I showed you wasn't relevant. There was nothing like that until the day you needed it. So the answer is the other data gave you the call. So I would obviously be looking at them both. But I think what I would say is, if you see a disconnect, as I actually see now, if you see a disconnect between the hard data and the data saying what people say. I mean, the data I'm talking about, you say to a firm, how you doing? What's going on? How's business? How's employment? What are you doing selling things? What are the prices of your goods? What are you doing about your investment? What about capacity constraints? And you say to people, well, what are the financial situation you find yourself in? What do you think about the state of the economy? Are you worried about losing your job? Turns out those have information. But I think we can say that because we know if you'd looked at those, you'd have seen the turn coming, and you wouldn't have seen it coming by looking at the standard things we as economists do. I mean, with hindsight, that's true. Okay. Foresight was another thing.
Let me continue. I mean, again, it's such a rich book. It was such a rich presentation. I'm just trying to flesh this out a bit, so then our colleagues in the room can follow up. You sort of ran through some very provocative ideas about one that's very intuitively appealing and common, but still interesting, that there is an association with essentially wage level and how people felt about Brexit or Trump or issues like that. But you also, that's an interesting political economy aspect, but then you also talked sort of back and forth about the happiness, that was a question of underemployment. And that, seems like a different kettle of fish, that underemployment could be someone who feels they are in the wrong job. That could be someone who's agonizing over part-time work and family work. That could be someone who's in need. So just if you could say a little bit more about how you think what you started with some of the political dissatisfaction links up with some of the happiness measures and what drives that.
So, I mean, I use the word happiness to refer to firms and people, right? So I always think of...
So you think companies are people?
Well, I sort of treat them that way. I mean, the firm can say, how are you feeling? And they say, I'm feeling good or I'm not good. You actually could score it. And those scores seem to have some value to them. So I think that's interesting. The thing with the individual data is there's a lot of puzzles in it. So the first thing in the US, the happiness data appears to be pretty flat. Other countries, that's not so true. But what you're seeing in some sense is the inequality divide in wages and income and wealth, and you're seeing it in happiness. So the latest data we have for the UK, people say, oh, we should develop a gross domestic happiness measure. Well, okay, let's think of this. So it turns out in the UK that happiness since 2013 is rising nicely, but so's unhappiness. So unhappiness and happiness together. So you say, oh, we're going to promote gross domestic happiness. So I say, so now you're going to raise gross domestic unhappiness, and now we're going to have to decide what weights we put on the unhappiness compared to the weights on the happiness. So you think the GDP is a bad measure. Wait till you look at this one. And then obviously in the US, there are things like bad mental health days and lots of other things. But I think these individual level happiness measures per se at this moment aren't that helpful, partly because we have this diversion going on with lots of people feeling very unhappy. I mean, the logic in a way is that if you look at the happiness data, the happiest countries in the world are the Scandinavian countries, Denmark, Norway, Sweden. And if you read Mary Daly's paper, where are the countries in the world that have the highest suicide rates? The same places. So I don't think this is simple. I think it's telling you about relative things mattering. But I simply say that what we're seeing is, and it's present in the data, and these kind of things are helpful, but at the same time as lots of people doing fine, lots of people hurting, and then you start to think about Brexit and voting for Trump and other things. So it's complicated, but I think this is a new avenue that we're learning in. But I certainly wouldn't say that we're in any state to go and say the Fed should go target gross domestic happiness. I think that would be ridiculous.
So one more question before I bridge to our distinguished audience. So picking up on that point about happiness, you had a chart that was 3 lines that was essentially college educated plus high school graduate, high school dropout in the US, and all of them seem to be minorly trending down or flat, but the one for high school dropouts was continuing to trend down quite steeply, and that's even during this recovery.
Absolutely.
Now, you may not have long enough time series to look at that, but just could you say a little more about why you think there's such a marked decline in happiness as we experience the longest expansion in the post-war period?
Well, I think the stuff that I do in the book is very much mapped to what Angus and Anne are doing.
Case indeed.
I mean, the story there is so we've written a lot of stuff about happiness being U-shaped in age. Unfortunately for you and me, we're on the upward sloping parts of our happiness function, which also means we're old. But anyway, so obviously that's the first thing. But the problem that we see is especially, it's not just the educated group, it's prime age. We used to think mostly white, but prime age, less educated men. That this group turns out to be the group that's fundamentally left behind. If you look at things like deaths from opioid poisonings, suicide rates are all rising for this left behind group. And so in a sense, this is the big story. It's the story about comparators. I mean, in some sense, the stuff in happiness does tell you useful things. It can tell you that people's happiness may well be more impacted by relative things than by absolute things. And I think, in a sense, I mean, I was reading General Hayden's book the other day, which actually said something in economics, which I thought was kind of interesting. He said that he realized that the cities around the world had more in common with each other than they had with the heartlands that they were cities in. So relative things matter. We compare ourselves in New York and London. It's like, I was at Trento the other day. Trento's like Washington, D.C. It's the same fundamental thing. So I think what you're seeing here is this left behind group who particularly have seen the decline in wages that their fathers and their grandfathers had, and a sense of hopelessness. So in the data, I see hopelessness and helplessness at the same time as growth. And there are these sort of separations. So that's what the book's about. And we can think about why that's happened, but it's especially happened to that group. And I would say that I think the initial work said it was white, prime age, less educated men, but I think the research is now saying that's probably not true. It's now quite clear that women get in there too, and the likelihood as we progress further is it's now less and less a white phenomenon as well. So this is a spreading phenomenon at the end of a slow recovery. I mean, who knows where it's going to go, but it's hard to see how that's going to get better. So that's what the source of it is, but I think it's the combination of all these things, and their work and mine fits very well together.
Let me bridge to
Thank
our
you.
audience with a final sort of comment. You showed your estimates of the wage equation,
Right.
which is that famous book and set of studies you did with Andrew Oswald. And from the time you published it, there was always discussions of this sort of duality. Should you be plotting in wage space or in inflation space? And so you showed your statistical results very nicely, honestly, talking about what fits. And you showed essentially a kinked wage curve.
Right.
Our colleagues, Joe Gagnon and Chris Collins, recently did a paper in which they showed evidence consistent with a kinked Phillips curve, so in inflation space rather than in wage level space. I was just wondering, looking to Joe in particular, if anything struck you about that issue, about why it's showing up the same in wages as it would in inflation, or if there's anything related you would like to raise at this time. You can, Jess, could you give Joe the microphone, please? Sorry, I didn't ask for it.
Well, we actually found a kink in both wage space and price space, and it was very similar to what you have, Danny. And we found that the location of the kink wasn't well identified.
Right.
You could put it. We put it closer to the Nehru, but
Yeah,
whatever. So I think that was similar. I would like to actually. I think one of them was just thinking. I was sitting here with. I need to go talk to Chris, and maybe we need to run your proposed new measure of the part-time for economic reasons based C and see how that works. And so I will do that. But
I mean, the benefit is you've got it for every individual, right? You can take the microdata and you can create whatever measures you want. So it's not like, it's not an aggregated measure, it's an individual measure.
But if may I ask a question? So it's a little different.
Please.
So the title of the book and the blurbs that you had up at the beginning were sort of about quality of job, and I could see how that relates to happiness and where all the good jobs gone. But most of your focus is on just the overall number of jobs or the overall employment rate. And so, do we take from that you think the main way to get to good jobs is just to have more jobs, or do we need to worry about other things? I guess why I ask that is that it may be true that the standard unemployment rate might overstate how tight the labor market is, but even your measures show that it's not that bad. It's at least as good as average, if not better. So why are the things getting worse?
I don't know that I agree with the last bit. I mean, I think up until 2008, it was fine. I think post 2008, that's not true, right? I mean, not least because the unemployment rate doesn't enter that wage equation, and the underemployment rate does. But you can't get the employment rate to either. I mean, what I have in my head is that, I talk about methods by which you could help wages, but I have in my head, I guess from Beveridge. Beveridge tries to talk about how the balance of power between workers and firms changes. And I like this concept he uses. He talks about workers standing by. His whole chapters in his book about what workers would see. And he talks about unemployed workers now suddenly realizing that the job offers started to come. And he talks about the job offer comes in from the old job that he has, but now all of a sudden, instead of there being no job offers coming, the world suddenly transitions at some kink point in the kind that you've said, and suddenly the balance of power is changing. And I think of it as you're in a dark room and you hit a wall, right? And we don't know where it is, and you and I are trying to think where that might be. But I kind of think that that's kind of what happens. And the other thing I have in my head, Richard Freeman taught me this, which is that he always said, Danny, remember, the people that do worst in the slump are the same people who do best in the boom. So I kind of have that in. Think of the series, which is the series that tanks the most. The answer is black youth unemployment rates and earnings of black youth in the recession. They get, horrible. But in the boom, this series goes from 12% to 38%. But in the boom, it goes from 38% back to 12 again. So I kind of have in my head that this is about redistribution. And then it means that, so I have views about inflation, and I've done work on the Fed's views about inflation. Looks to me to be wrong. I have a paper where when I was at the bank, people always used to say to me, when you're a policymaker, people tell you all about how inflation really matters so much. So I went and measured it. And I have data for 1 million people in Europe, and I measured what impact on well-being does a 1 percentage point change in inflation have compared to a 1 percentage point change in unemployment? Answer, 5.5 times worse for the 1 percentage point change in unemployment. And when I presented this, Charlie Evans said to me, he said, Danny, that's great, but I didn't need the 5.5. So I said, why is that? He said, 1 was completely fine, because he said, I was always told by all the hawks that it was 30 to inflation to 1 to unemployment. So he said 1 works just fine. But I sort of take the view that we haven't seen inflation now, and that redistribution is kind of what we're going to see, and the costs are less than the benefits.
And to give credit, where credit is due, I think Chair Powell and Vice Chair Clarida have been actually much more open to that.
Yes.
Explicitly.
Yes.
On how, please.
Thank you. Yes, good. And thank you, Joe. I mean, I agree.
Angelo Ubide from Citadel. Danny, this is a great book, and I think it puts the emphasis on one thing that is very important, that is the total amount of hours worked as the relevant variable rather than the total amount of jobs.
Right.
Now, that is true, and that's a fact. And I think part of what's happening is that due to technology, globalization, and all the things we've discussed, we've discovered there are many more hours available in the world.
Right.
And so the amount of slack measured as total hours work is bigger.
Right.
So there are 2 questions that come from this. One is, what do we do about it? Is it only a demand issue? So you just keep the economy running hotter, so you fill all those hours. But the other more interesting one, I think, is the following. We have a welfare system that is designed to protect jobs, not hours worked.
Correct.
So do we need to change or think about changing the welfare system in a way that we also think about the amount of hours worked? In other words, do you need a jobs guarantee or minimum wage or basic income? What is the policy that better addresses what you have identified as the problem?
I mean, great questions. So when I first started doing labor economics, there was a whole literature, people here, particularly a British literature. It was called Employment Functions, and Naderi and Rosen and all kinds of other people wrote this. And this is sort of the puzzle in my head, right? So I always thought, and I was taught, this is probably 40 years ago, I always thought that a firm would react like this. And obviously I'm going to give you a puzzle, but it's not like that. I thought a firm's sitting there and a positive shock comes in. What does the firm do? First thing it does is it says, well, let's work a bit more. Let's have the people work a bit extra. Maybe we'll give them a bit of overtime. Maybe we'll put an overtime shift in. And then what we'll do is we'll maybe put a second shift on or something. And then we'll hire temporary workers. And then fourth, we'll bring in extra people. So what we're seeing is the unemployment rate on the outside comes down. Certainly in other places you see employment rising, but they're not adjusting at the margins in the way that our economics teaches us, right? So I've had a thought, which actually may be a big breakthrough in some sense. So here's the story. In our work before, Marx's reserve army of the unemployed, and we'll get to the policy in a second. Marx's reserve army of the unemployed was like the wage curve, right? The bigger the pool of labor out there, the less his wage levels, and so that's what kept pay in check. Well, now we have a slightly different world, and that world is the firm itself has workers inside that firm. Some are normally employed in the hours that they'd like, they're on their labor supply curves, and the other folks over there are not. And what we're seeing is now pay is maybe set at the internal margin. And if I've got time, I'll give you a quick story. When I was on the MPC, somebody called me and said, would you like to come to see Bosch Engineering, big German engineering plant in Wales? He said, because I want to talk to you about what I've heard you say. So I go there, and there's a huge plant, like 3,000 people working in it. And there's 2 production lines here working away. And on over here, there's 1,000 people with kind of different color hats on. I said, well, what's going on? And he said, well, over there was our normal workforce, and here we had this giant line we were trying to run, and it broke. We were trying to introduce a new line, and I had to get the orders. So I hired 1,000 Poles. And I said, okay. So he said, well, 2 things. He said, first of all, so you understand, at 8 o'clock in the morning, before the shift starts at 9, there are 1,000 Poles in the car park, and none of those are in the car park, right? And then he said, and we started to talk about wage round, and he said, there's going to be no wage round. And I said, why is that? He said, because the people over there paid £25 an hour know that the people over there at £15 an hour can replace them. So there's no wage conversation at all. The pressure is within the organization. So that's part of what's going on. Obviously, we need to think about adequate incomes. I mean, some of the big story, I mean, in the UK and the US, there's a big debate going on in the UK about a living wage and about a minimum wage. And we've had that debate. But what you see in these data is having a high enough hourly wage is not enough if you can't get enough hours, right? So you've got an hour, many of the people we look at on the minimum wage say, I've got 12 hours of it, but I want 30, I'd take 50. I can't get that. So I think obviously we now have to start to think about basic income in return for a particular kind of job. I don't quite know how to go with it because I'm worried about programs like JTPA where you find that you put the program out there, the rate of return is negative, the Finland income experiment. But I think we have to kind of deal with this, particularly where firms are now using that margin. But of course, my answer back to Joe's point, in the UK, there are things called excess what are the contracts called?
0 hours.
0 hours contracts. Well, think of that. These are 0 hours contracts. The worker really wants this on a Sunday. These are legal contracts. You can't work for anybody else. You have no idea how many hours a week you're going to work, which day and when. And on a Sunday night, it says to you, right, you kind of come in Thursday from 4 p.m. till midnight, right? And so we're still seeing those existing as the central bank says we're at full employment. Well, my sense is that full employment wipes that out. So I don't know. I think it's a great question you ask, but I think something fundamentally has changed. And it may well be that we've got to stop thinking about dealing with people who are unemployed, which is or in disability or whatever. And many of these same people, last thing, ABAL's shown that lots of these people who are out of the labor force, they're in and out all the time. So in a sense, what you've got is in-work poverty. And the answer is, that's the answer to your question. We have tools, Maginot Line weapons that dealt with the last crisis and not this crisis. And that's, I think it's a big deal. So a great question. I try my best.
Thank you. Yeah, yes, at the back. If you could stand up at the mic, please.
I know this person. Hi, Carol.
Hi, Danny.
Sorry,
Anyway,
could you
Carol
identify
Graham
yourself?
Sorry?
Sorry, could you identify yourself for those who don't know?
Carol Graham from Brookings. So I haven't read your whole book yet, I'm sorry, but we've talked about these things a bit. I'm curious when you talk about the in and out of the labor force.
Right.
We know in the US, prime age males out of the labor force are a really troubled lot.
Right.
A lot of them are on opioids or, in the deaths of despair category. So do you have anything in your data on movement from out of the labor force back in? How much, once people drop out, I think it's more of a phenomenon here, but obviously it's still in the UK as well.
Right. Well, John Abel has this paper in Journal of Labour Economics doing exactly that. And he says that the attachment is, Adam and I tried to think about this. His view is that you shouldn't just look at the moment in space and say these people are out of the labor force. His work says that, over a period of 2 years, they're in and they're out. So their attachment may be relatively weak, but it's not that they're not employed. It was they were employed a week ago. They're not employed today. And the sense would be, in a sense, the Aronson-Washer paper suggested that the participation rates of prime-age males wouldn't rise on females, and we've seen that that's just not true, particularly amongst prime-age females at the lower levels of education. It's risen. The phenomenon in the UK is a bit different. In some sense, what's happened in the UK, rather than drop out of the labor force, you've seen a huge rise in the self-employment rate. And this is, I gave a book talk the other day in a bookshop and listened to all these people, ordinary people, just telling me all about how many people were struggling. Real earnings of the self-employed in the UK are down 27% in 5 years. And they were all talking about the worry about what's coming. So in the UK, if you ran out of benefits here, in the US, you'd leave the labor force. In the UK, you'd go to pretty bad self-employment with the expectation that now all of a sudden, when the turn down comes, you're going to see, and we're starting to see it, big movements in self-employment numbers. I mean, the US has got less than half the rate that the UK has in self-employment. But these people are struggling, all of them. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. Jessica, if you could put the mic over here, please.
Arthur Alexander at Johns Hopkins, across the street.
Thank you, sir.
Two quick questions. One, if there's this excess supply in the hours,
Yes.
is it aggregate demand
Yes.
that we should be looking at?
I think so.
And when did this happen? I mean, when did
Yes.
this shift between people
Yes.
and hours? You talk about the transition, but do you get a sense of when it occurred?
Yes. It's clear that I made an error prior to 2008 in the wage curve book, that I hadn't really realized that underemployment was a phenomenon. But it doesn't change anything, right? So the wage curve is right. It's just an additional thing that we should have thought about. It looks that once you get to 2008, there's just the whole, I mean, if you look at that employment rates, there's just Joe's point is right in the sense that you say it's 2008, it could be 2009. I don't exactly know the day where this thing happened, but once you start to put the thing together, it looks like that, I couldn't date it, but let's guess it's 2008, but it might be 10, it's something around there. In the UK, it's probably a little bit later. It's probably nearer to 2010. Pretty much when, if you look at the productivity series turns at one day. It turns at the day that the coalition imposed austerity. You can almost see the series just do that. That's as good as anything. That's your aggregate demand thing. They cut public spending like crazy, and it looks like the whole series moves, and then that looks like the break. But I agree. Someone should go and tell me the day. Thank you.
At the back, Mike.
Sir.
Ted Truman from the Peterson Institute.
Yes, sir.
One comment and two questions, assuming Adam wants me to take two questions. The comment, I may not heard you correctly, and I'm old. You guys are young, by the way.
Adam's young.
Well, yeah, I know how young he is relative to me. So I thought I heard you at the beginning saying that the Federal Reserve in September 2008 didn't know what was going on. I think that's probably not how I read the data. I mean, they moved interest rates. They were the only central bank that massively moved interest rates starting in 2007. And by September 2008, they were very low by international standards. I think they were down to 2%, 2.5% at that point, and then they cut it 2% in October. So I think they were relatively ahead of everybody else. Actually, interestingly, the fund was pretty good too at that time. So, and they were ahead of most of the other countries. But I may not be right. That's just a comment. The question is, in your data about the first question, in your data about the fear of unemployment, right, leading essentially actual unemployment, you ask yourself what's the mechanism there. One hypothesis would be that fear of unemployment leads to restraint in demand.
Yes.
Right? And that feeds back. So one question would be, technical question, I guess, is have you looked at the fear of unemployment series that you have relative to consumption series and so forth and so on? Does it do better than your consumer confidence measures, which at least when I used to be in this business didn't tell you very much. Told you something about today, but not much about tomorrow. So that's one question. The other question is you had all these data on the different European countries.
Right.
And you said you used them to try to tease out where the United States' lack of data would fall. And you found that there were sufficient differences, if I heard you correctly,
Yes.
that you couldn't generalize. So the question is whether you turned it around and say, so what is it about, so you have 25 or so observations, right? What does that tell you about labor market structures and policies and so forth and so on in those countries that generate similar in some sense, but different in other sense results in terms of your survey?
Okay. Great question. Thank you. I think you're right. I mean, maybe I exaggerated it a little bit, but if you read the first thing is in the US went into recession kind of first. The US went in December 2007. Most others didn't go in for a few months until a few months later. And you're absolutely right that the Fed actually did act. But I think I just read those minutes very carefully. And I think if you read Bernanke says that growth is going to slow markedly, and he says something like, and it may well be that we'll actually the NBR will end up calling this a weak recession, something like that. So I think, you're right. I think they got it more than others did. The fear of unemployment series, the great thing about these data that we have is that actually people don't realize that most of the consumer confidence indices are actually made up of a series of components. And it turns out that we have this for every European country for every month for 40 years. And essentially, we actually get the question that you've asked, which is, tell me about your consumption, tell me about what you think about your financial situation. And it turns out, all the work that I've been doing is that this series is the one that does better than all of those. But it's a great question. We're working on it. But in the UK, this fear series seems to be important. The last one, I think maybe I didn't make it quite clear that it doesn't look that the makeup between voluntary part-timers, the involuntary part-timers, and the full-timers is the crucial story. What it turns out is that matters is the number of excess hours, right? So what we can pick up in these countries is not, because I can always get part-time for economic reasons, just as I can in the United States. But when you aggregate up all the excess hours in the series, the blue line, which is how many additional hours you want to do, appears to have quite a lot of action. But I can't exactly answer your question, because at this moment we don't really have great wage series for those other countries. But I think I take your point. I mean, the structure, which one's which and who's got the most, it isn't helpful. But I've only just done that, and I didn't know it till I'd done it. I was hoping to be able to answer your question, and those results were disappointing. But if you look, the one place, just the last thing to say, it looks in places where the unemployment rate is high, that these underemployment series are pretty low. The thing I'm working on right now is they look horrible in France. If there's one place where the unemployment rate appears to really underestimate how much slack there is, so it's not kind of interesting. Where would be the one place, given that it's the one place where we just had riots, where the unemployment rate doesn't look like it would. You'd pick, well, when you add on the under, then France just looks really different. So I'm working on trying to think about France and why France looks different. But the underemployment rate in France looks like a really big deal.
That's very intriguing. Obviously, the cross-national variation, as you and Ted got into, is very intriguing. We have time for one more question. If someone, please, Prakash.
And the gentleman there's been putting his hand.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. So why don't we take both questions and then they can.
Thank you.
Prakash Langani from the IMF. I was wondering if you've done some sort of Taylor rule calculations where if you, instead of the GDP gap, use your underemployment measure, where you think policy rates should be right now.
Okay, and let's get the second question before.
The obvious person to
Danny,
do that is
let's
you.
get the second question.
Sorry.
Yeah, thank you, Adam. Jack Goldzone, George Mason University.
Yes.
Let's get back to the politics. We see a big rural-urban divide,
Absolutely.
and I wanted to ask how that shows up in your data and whether there are gaps that need to be paid attention to there as well.
Thank you, Jack.
Thank you. Can I do the second point? The rural-urban thing really matters in it's the same sort of context as my story about Hayden's cities being comparable. A lot of the stuff in there is about the lack of good jobs in those rural areas. In some sense, you can look. It's the same in the UK, and there's a sense of hopelessness. And I think one of the big deals we're going to have to think about is what happens down the road. Just give you an example. A colleague of mine lives in Luzerne County, Pennsylvania. His parents live there. And Trump went there. Obama won twice. I still think it was a rural, but let's think of rural or old, right? Trump won it by 6 points and basically went there and said, we'll bring back coal jobs. And my friend said, go and look. So I went and looked. And it turns out in the 50s, the Susquehanna River moved, right? And there was I think it was the Kent mine. Anyway, the point of the story is you go to the Luzerne County website and it says there are millions of tons of coal under Luzerne County, none of which is mineable. So I think the issue is I'm going to wait and go back. The thing we have to think about is, well, what happens when you don't deliver? what happens, I mean, in Britain, it's really interesting that despite the fact that it's a hurt in those places, polling in Britain for Brexit pretty much remained the same, and the same in these cold places. So I think this is very interesting. In a sense, I think you just got to wait a bit, right? And the coal ain't coming back to Luzerne County. You've heard it here. But the town doesn't think it is either. So then there's this disconnect. But obviously the urban, rural, Prakesh you're the obvious person in the world to do that. Good idea. I have been trying to think about it. Lots more stuff to do about could you enter it into those rules. We're now at the point, I think, where we have adequate data. There's a nice paper from you guys. There's a nice IMF paper which actually shows that this underemployment measure will outperform. It's a little bit different because it shows that underemployment is an improvement over the unemployment rate across countries, but it doesn't kill off the unemployment rate like mine does. But I think we're all in the same boat here. You guys have done exactly that, and I think 5 years ago we probably would not have known that. So this is new. I think we have to go back and think about the dynamics, and as you say, to think about a Taylor rule. In a sense, the Taylor rule, in a sense, your question is, let's try and get an adequate measure of slack to enter into the Taylor rule. What if you create an hours-based measure and you add it to other? That's the obvious thing to do. I've always thought, you write wages up here and you write some measure of slack. And obviously what we should be doing is and what my measure does, it has the right characteristic because it gives you more slack than lots of other things do. So your question is, if you bung more, if you make the labour market slack variable and the Taylor rule bigger, what's it going to do? Right, and then you worry about those properties. And I think those kinds of experiments with Joe's thing about perhaps there's, when there's some sort of kink point and you can do these estimates about where does the series break and then, so I think that's really a big deal. But I think the contribution is that you get more labour market slack when we're all kind of on that, right? I think generally we'd say we're on that issue now because it doesn't have the right wage cap. We have to have a story. Who else has got a story of why wage growth is weak? This is the story.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
That's
very
a great
nice
note to the Lyndon. Thank you, Danny. The book is not working. Where have all the good jobs gone? This meeting is adjourned.
Thank you all. Thank you, mate.